Hello and good morning. I am Matt Reardon. I am filling in here for Eric Snodgrass because on rare occasions in summer we do allow him to leave the weather office. So he's enjoying that. Looking at this radar loop here, this is from Florida, really over the last kind of 12 to 18 hours or so. And the first thing you see, I think, is that the southern half of Florida has received a tremendous amount of rain just over last night here into this morning, still falling, here as of early this morning. If you look closely, something that kind of caught my eye here is there's a little spin up here early in the loop. It's going to reset here in just a second. If you look in here, do you see that spin in the atmosphere? You can make it out in the radar there. That's actually, an attempt with all the convection, all the rainfall, of kind of a tropical process, attempting to create something of, a tropical depression. Of course, it's going over land here this morning, so the time has run out on that, but just gives you a sense for how much rain has fallen. South of Tampa Bay, you can see the rain just training over the same area here near Sarasota, where we saw urban and street flooding. Potentially 8 inches or more fell there just over the last 24 hours or so. And then some of these other areas here across the southern half of the state receiving pretty high values as well. Briefly, the National Hurricane Center, identified that area of spin here with a low chance of development, but nonetheless, indicative of how much convection was occurring over that same area. If we look at the radar-derived precipitation estimates just over the last kind of 2 days, I did 2 days, but I'm sure if I jumped it to just 24 hours, some of these values pretty tremendous, talking upwards of 10 inches again in parts of west central Florida near Sarasota, and then continuing further south, kind of near the Everglades. But some other areas here still getting in on meaningful precipitation of an inch or more. I think that's relevant because this is an area, the southern half of the state, that's been under drought, the last 8 weeks or so. So this wasn't the most ideal way to get out of the drought, but the case tends to be that big droughts ends in big floods. And I think we, unfortunately, over the last kind of 24 hours, we've seen that in Florida. Unfortunately, the forecast calls for additional rainfall. Just look at the 48-hour forecast here from the National Weather Service NDFD product. Some of the same areas, right, that I just mentioned a few slides ago are now under the gun for, again, pretty significant rainfall amounts, 5 inches, 6 inches plus, depending on which exact areas some of these thunderstorms train over. Much kind of like the pattern or behavior that we saw last night. You get these little spin ups and they can just pump moisture into the same area, and that regardless of which city or where you're at in the world, that's going to overwhelm the drains and the hydrology there. If we look at a longer range forecast, this all the way out to June 17th of Monday, and unfortunately not a huge change in this forecast. So these storms likely to be training along what is a stalled front here across parts of the Gulf of Mexico and extending across the southern peninsula of Florida. I'll play this forward, into next week, and some of that activity finally decreasing as we get more through the next work week, so out into Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So hopefully a reprieve coming as some of the focus in the Gulf of Mexico shifts toward the southwest, which we'll be talking about in just a few slides here. Taking a big picture overlook at the drought monitor here, I mentioned again, that's south central Florida drought. So would expect, right, some improvement here, both in the update that will come out tomorrow, Thursday, from the drought monitor from the USDA, and then perhaps further next week. So alleviating drought concerns, right, the silver lining here, but unfortunately quite a bit of flooding concerns still left to materialize over the next kind of 5 to 7 days or so in Florida. I want to shift gears a bit and look over at the European forecast. This has been something we've been following closely, been discussing it with Eric. I want to start here. This is a forecast from the ECMWF of the jet stream, really about tomorrow morning. And I'm showing this here because there's a lot going on, but if you look here over Scandinavia, we see the winds in the jet stream kind of coming out of the north, coming back up from the south here over northern Europe. And that is very different from what we've seen over the last few weeks. In fact, the last few weeks we've seen just about the opposite of this kind of flow regime. And so we're finally seeing this shift to more southerly flow, more southwesterly flow through parts of south or western Europe, and then more importantly, parts of Eastern Europe. This flow coming up out of the south from areas like the Mediterranean. The Black Sea is in here, a source of moisture. and bringing some of that renewed moisture into Eastern Europe, into Eastern Ukraine, parts of southern Russia, and the grain belt there. And this is a really total pattern flip from what we've seen. And the expectation is that we're going to see increased rainfall over the next 7 days. This forecast here from the ECMWF, you can see kind of two areas of focus here. Eastern Ukraine, southern Russia, the grain belt there, and then Western Europe with more precipitation. Central Europe, getting a break from some of the precipitation they've seen here in late May and early June with a shift to drier conditions expected. Now, I'll start this here at the beginning. This is the next 7 days of the forecast out through June 19th. So you can see the rain here, parts of Eastern Europe, parts of Western Europe. But as I take this forecast further out into the future, this is a rolling 7-day window of anomalies. Not a huge change in that pattern other than just a slow kind of eastward shift in the western part and the slow kind of eastward shift into more portions of the grain belt here in southern Russia, which has been dealing with frost, then heat, some more frost, and then drought concern here in parts of early summer. So some rainfall there, I think, is significant. One kind of caveat I have to add to that is parts of Western Europe will be cooler under this regime, but with that southwesterly flow coming up like this, while it's bringing moisture to parts of Eastern Europe, parts of Central and Western Asia, it's bringing heat into anomalous heat into parts of those areas here. So some of these areas, if you look closely, that might miss out on some of this precipitation here, will soon be dealing with some more heat as we go through the next kind of 7 to 10 days here. So some heat stress increasing here in June. However, with the precipitation, I think that's a trade they'll make. We jump over and look at North America's own precipitation pattern. This is a 10-day forecast from the ECMWF ensemble, just want to give us a broad overview of where we're expecting the storm tracks and the significant rainfall to come just over 10 days before getting into the specifics of this, which we will certainly do in just a few slides. The first thing that, of course, jumps off the map here is if we look down at the Gulf of Mexico. I mentioned there's the rainfall expected over the next 5 days or so in Florida, which is expected to wane going out into next week, but I think the focus, during that same time will shift over to parts of the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, expecting the development potentially of, maybe even a tropical depression or a weak tropical storm. The details on that are unclear this early in the forecast. What is more clear is that a lot of precipitation is coming to parts of eastern Mexico and potentially the Gulf Coast of the U.S., which we'll break down in just a second here. I mentioned that potential for tropical development, the National Hurricane Center identifying a 20% chance of development here in the Bay of Campeche as that system begins to get going here. Again, I don't think the huge talking point of this portion of the forecast is whether we get something of a tropical depression or a weak tropical storm. It's going to be the rainfall, which is we have much higher confidence that we're going to see very anomalous rainfall in some of the areas here, regardless of whether we call it a depression or not. And I think one reason for that potential development is something we're looking at here. This is a forecast from the European model of 850 millibar vorticity, and it's a fancy meteorological term for spin in the lower levels of the atmosphere. And if you're forecasting tropical cyclones, we're often just looking for spin in the low levels of the atmosphere, especially over the tropics. And so I placed this here over the Caribbean. So you have Mexico up here near the left or the west side of this map. Here's the Caribbean, the Atlantic Ocean over here to the east. And as I play this forward, if you look closely across Central America, you can almost see that the winds are coming in from the west here, coming in from the east here, the trade winds from the Atlantic. And this produces something of a counterclockwise spin near Central America. This is actually something we call a Central American gyre, which tends to form in late May and early June, like we're seeing here. And occasionally, these gyres, if they're strong enough, can help increase that vorticity enough to actually develop some tropical cyclones to bring some deep tropical moisture up further north into parts of Mexico or the U.S. Gulf Coast. If I play this forecast through Friday, then Saturday the 15th, you can see exactly that scenario where that gyre moves a little bit north and helps to coalesce some of that vorticity or spin in the lower levels of the atmosphere right over the Bay of Campeche. And that's precipitating that development, no pun intended, of the potential for a storm here southeast of Texas and east of Mexico here. Now, I mentioned all that, and we do see this kind of climatological peak in these gyres here in May and June. That's what this paper here from Philippe Papin, they deduced that these gyres develop out of Central America typically in the kind of early summer and then early autumn period. And so this one really kind of right on time just in terms of looking at historical averages. But regardless, whether it develops into a very weak storm or not, the story, like I mentioned, is precipitation. So this forecast here of 10-day precipitation anomalies from the ECMWF model shows just tremendous rainfall here in parts of eastern and central Mexico. And I have to mention that some of these areas here have been stricken with pretty terrible drought and heat here. And so we've gone through spring here and then now early summer. There's been impacts to the supply chain, some of the specialty crops grown down there. If you have been looking for something like sriracha in your grocery store, it's been hard to find. Some of the production being halted due to just the lack of rainfall in some of these areas here in Mexico where they grow the peppers for products like that. Kind of curiously, if we look over at the ECMWF AIFS forecast, and I'll make this equal to what we were just looking at there from the operational ECMWF to compare it. Take that out to 10 days. Next week, the focus of the precipitation from the AIFS, that is the ECMWF artificial intelligence model, is much more further toward the north. So eastern Mexico is still getting some precipitation out of that system, but that plume of moisture extending more into parts of Houston, parts of southeast Texas, even getting all the way into parts of west Texas at times, and then extending over to Louisiana. So these are two pretty big differences in the forecast. And I think the reason for that disagreement extends back to the fact that we're talking about this Central American gyre and earlier development or an early coalescence of that vorticity, or let's say, you get more a lobe of vorticity developing on the north end of the gyre here, that can spin up and take the moisture a little bit further toward the east or northeast end of the U.S. Gulf Coast. So I think some more uncertainty here than we typically expect in something like a 5 to 7 day forecast. But regardless, the end of the weekend, getting out into the early next work week, we'll be watching for potentially anomalous precipitation, very anomalously so, depending on the exact development here. And couldn't rule out a very early season kind of June tropical storm. Hesitant to say the word hurricane, but maybe even a weak hurricane or two. But again, like I said before, and I'll stress it again, I think the precipitation story will end up being a bigger one. Let's jump ahead here. This is the GFS forecast. This one a little more up to date, coming out at 6C here. Distributes the moisture a little bit more evenly across the western Gulf here. So eastern Mexico getting in on some of the increased moisture, and parts of southeast Texas and Louisiana. If we scrutinize it a little bit closer, we'll take a look at this more specifically as we go through the slides here. But getting that moisture even up into parts of the south and mid-south here, which the other models did not do. As a result of this, the Climate Prediction Center, or the CPC, has released a moderate risk for heavy rainfall, again, getting out into early next work week here for parts of the Gulf Coast states. So they've obviously seen kind of that spread in the models here, but it is enough to warrant a moderate risk for heavy rainfall here. And then the active storm track here through the northern Midwest, bringing a slight risk for there over that kind of same time period. This is looking down. This is NASA's GRACE groundwater drought indicator. Again, just kind of a big picture view of where eastern Mexico and then really much of the country has been dealing with that drought concern. So the more southern kind of projection of that forecast there, I think, assuming we can avoid some major impactful flooding events, is not bad news for their water situation. Some parts of the south and southeast U.S. perhaps looking for a break in the precipitation. So kind of a big fork in the road in the forecast here. I'll be curious to see kind of as we go through the weekend. I think we'll have a better view of where that gyre is going to spin up an actual system that we'll have to watch and then forecast for. Speaking of the ECMWF AIFS forecast, wanted to take a look at the trough ridge pattern as we go through the next week. I think there's quite a few things to talk about here. First thing I'll do here on Wednesday morning, I'll make this kind of valid as of midday Wednesday. And if you look closely at the western U.S., we see a ridge here over the west. This is kind of a continuation of something of a heat wave or early June, early summer heat wave that we've been following in the western U.S. Just yesterday in Phoenix, nearly tying a record high for the date at 113 degrees Fahrenheit at the airport there in Phoenix. Unfortunately, this cutoff low here has been keeping the June gloom around for parts of southern California. and kind of forecasting the heat wave and the high pressure system and the ridge over the west, that usually is a recipe to help kind of erode that marine layer, kick out the June gloom, allowing you to get back to the coast, at least in the morning or lunchtime, and get some sun in Southern California. Unfortunately, just kind of poorly timed with this cutoff low here down here that has, I think, robbed us of the opportunity to kick out the June gloom, at least for a week or two. Regardless, we can see the zonal flow that Eric has been talking extensively about here. This one current as of Wednesday, bringing that storm track through parts of the northern Midwest, parts of the prairie into southern Canada. And I'll take this forecast out forward here through Thursday now into Friday, looking out into Saturday now of June 15th. And we're seeing that ridge break down a bit in the west, seeing it shift toward the east, now over the Corn Belt as we go through the weekend here, and looking at this trough moving out of the Northeast Pacific and starting to get into the western U.S. So take this forecast forward into Monday, and then Tuesday of next week, we've now really kind of have that flip in the pattern where we've returned to troughing in the western U.S., bringing temperatures down from the Pacific Northwest and parts of the northern interior U.S. Rockies. And then the eastern U.S., big warm up, especially for the mid-Atlantic, New England, but that'll include parts of the Corn Belt here, less or so on the kind of west edge of that ridge. If we look closely down here, again, the Yucatan Bay of Campeche, we can see kind of the upper level reflection of that system we're watching coming out of the deep Caribbean associated with that gyre. This is on Tuesday, early morning Tuesday, the 18th. So we go through the 19th and then the 20th into Thursday, and see that ridge just kind of cementing itself, at least on this forecast here from the ECMWF AIFS, as we go through the end of the week next week, keeping the heat around, prompting some a little bit of heat concern here in the eastern U.S., parts of the Corn Belt, with some weaker troughing across the west, keeping things a little bit cooler over there compared to the heat wave conditions that we've seen, certainly at the beginning of this week here, but even at the end of last week where we saw temperatures soar into the triple digits in parts of the Central Valley of California, and certainly south through Arizona and southeastern California. If we jump over and look at the ECMWF ENS, this is the operational, so comparing it to what we just saw from the ECMWF, getting a little bit different opinion here. The forecast for today is going to look very, very similar, so I'm just going to fast forward through the weekend here quickly. We see that kind of weak ridging first start to build into the eastern U.S. We see the troughing moving in over the western U.S. That's consistent with what we just saw from the AIFS. So we take this through Wednesday the 19th, see even more potent ridging here across parts of New England and far eastern Canada, and a little bit more potent troughing here, I think, across the western U.S., maybe compared to the exact ECMWF AIFS run that we just saw. This would put a little bit more of that anomalous heat further east, I think, over the mid-Atlantic and parts of New England near the end of next week. But then if I take this out a little bit further, we see kind of this broad ridging here across maybe the whole eastern 2/3 or eastern half of the country here. I think, at this point in summer, with the jet stream kind of retreating north, we're at I said this before as regards to the gyre, but it's another fork on the road in the forecast. Are we going to see this ridge kind of entrench itself across the east, or will it try to shift back as some of the operational forecasts suggest? That would return heat to the western U.S. and at least bring things a little bit more moderate or seasonal across the east. It's not clear, looking at this ECMWF forecast here, the ensemble, if I force the AIFS to give me an answer, taking it all the way out to the end of June, it actually returns some heat here to the western U.S. That's why I said some of these operational runs, bringing the heat back west, bringing cooler weather into the eastern U.S. Well, if I take the ECMWF ENS out that far, we don't get a firm answer either way. If anything, maybe kind of leaning more toward cooler in the west, a little bit warmer in the east here. If I jump over and look at the GFS ensemble over that same time period, near the end of June, talking about week 2 plus, it's trying to push that heat back west. So maybe a little bit more support in shifting that heat back to the west at the end of June. But like I said, something of a fork in the road looking at the long-range forecast, as is often the case, but I think even more so in summer, where we have a lack of that jet stream influence. Where these ridges set up, they can entrench themselves, and then we're looking at ridge riding thunderstorms, which can set up their own boundaries. And what I'm really kind of getting at is this is looking like we're getting into that kind of true summer pattern, which is kind of like a wild goose chase as a forecaster, determining where these ridges are going to set up. But at the very least I can do is kind of walk you through what we're seeing and what we're thinking, the conversations that we're having. If Look at the, this is the latest NWS all hazards map as of this morning here. You can see 7:20 a.m. Central Time. What you're seeing here in these kind of hot pink, or maybe I guess I call that dark pink colors here, is the excessive heat warnings that have continued for parts of Arizona here underneath the ridge that we were just talking about. These extending, I believe, out through Thursday when temperatures will moderate some as that upper level low kind of shoots across the area here. With minimal other impacts. Heat advisories here in southern New Mexico, parts of Utah, parts of the San Joaquin Valley, and then the Sacramento Valley, dealing with the excessive heat warnings as well here this morning. Southeast, or I should say the southern kind of tip of Florida, based on the beginning of this video, probably not a surprise to see the flood warnings there, or the flood watch, I should say, because of the unfortunate additional rainfall expected over the next 5 days, kind of through the weekend here. Wanted to get a little bit more specific with those temperature forecasts as we go through the week here and finish up and get into the weekend. High temperatures today here on Wednesday from the NDFD, the product from the National Weather Service. Pretty simple story here across the West, kind of a continuation of the heat wave, not the extreme heat that we saw, I think, at the end of last week, at least relative to normal for June. You can see parts of Arizona extending up into well into the triple digits, over 110 degrees Fahrenheit, pushing back toward the triple digits in parts of the Central Valley of California, maybe a little bit higher here in the Sacramento Valley here today, prompting the excessive heat warning versus some of the other areas. And then has been the case for much of spring, much of May gray, and the June gloom, seeing the continuation of that strong marine layer along the coast, keeping that stratus around the coast shrouded in clouds, at least into the afternoon, and some of that pushing into some of the inland valleys, ruining sometimes what could be a nice summer June day, unfortunately, with that cutoff low. I'm going to take that forecast into the future now. Let's go to Thursday, Friday, and then Saturday. And what you can see just over 72 hours is that heat shifting into the central part of the country as that ridge moves east. And then we talked about that upper level trough starting to move into the northwest, bringing temperatures down there. Take it into Sunday and then Monday, June 17th. And now we get some of that more anomalous heat, 90-degree temperatures really settling in across parts of the eastern Corn Belt, the mid-Atlantic, warmer temperatures extending really across the northeast third of the U.S. It's not a term I use very often, the northeast third. The area here, the Great Lakes, Mid-Atlantic, and New England, with areas, let's call it the northwest third of the U.S. here in the northwest, and parts of the northern plains getting cooler temperatures as we go into the next work week, and then extending that out into Tuesday. So you can see that shift that we underwent in just kind of 5 to 6 days there in the forecast. And just to take it out a little bit further here, that product only goes out to Tuesday. This is looking at the ECMWF operational, so not the ECMWF AIFS, but the operational here for next week out into what we'll call, let's say, Wednesday, June 19th here. So I take that forward into Thursday, and then Friday, the end of the week. The reason I'm showing you this one is because while we're confident about the anomalous heat moving in here, we have seen this shift back toward the west from the ECMWF as we get out into the end of next week. So that would keep some higher temperatures around, some anomalous heat here across the central part of the country, the central and western Corn Belt, overlapping with some areas here that do have lingering dryness, that do have lingering drought, say compared to parts of the central Corn Belt that have been very wet this spring, at least earlier, starting to dry out just a little bit here in some of the areas here, particularly in parts of north central Indiana and western Ohio, seeing a little bit of water stress here just in kind of the recent weeks. So keeping an eye on this next week, we add some heat to that, and suddenly that concern starts to grow a little bit. Don't want to sound any alarms on drought just yet, but this is what we have to keep an eye on as we get into June and July. If we look at the CPC temperature risks going out kind of almost through the end of June here, you can see that excessive heat, moderate risk here, again, over that same time period I said, kind of the end of the next work week, with this kind of broader risk area across let's kind of call that the eastern third of the country. But kind of curiously, there's the slight risk. I think that slight's appropriate for the western parts of the interior here, getting out near the end of June. Remember, I showed you in some of those operational long-range model runs, they wanted to flip that heat back west and maybe bring the east a little bit cooler. Now, the ECMWF ENS was not necessarily in agreement. If anything, it had maybe the west a little bit cooler and kept that heat around to the east. So that's that kind of fork in the road, that we've been talking about, at least the CPC kind of going with this slight here. I think that's appropriate just based on a few more models supporting that western heat and the ridge there. I want to jump to a long-range conversation before I finish up here. This is the forecast from the NMME for July, August, and September. There's a lot going on in this map, but what you can kind of see here is, I think at least for the end of summer, a pretty typical La Nina pattern. So seeing La Nina develop in the Central Pacific and the kind of global effects of that. Well, we would typically expect more precipitation falling in parts of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, stronger Indian monsoons, seeing all that here from the NMME. We would also expect in a La Nina year, all things equal, a more potent, more frequent Atlantic hurricane season, and many of the forecasts calling for what will likely be an above average season. With a grain of salt that long-range forecasting and seasonal forecasting for hurricanes comes with many challenges. But you see this increased precipitation signal from the NMME across essentially what we call, the main development region of the Atlantic and the Caribbean here for July, August, September. Pretty indicative, I think, of resolving a stronger hurricane season here, with some dryness across the central part of the U.S., at least along the Front Range, maybe even getting out into parts of the plains here. Don't see a huge dry signal in parts of the Corn Belt and parts of the Mid-Atlantic, and maybe even a wet signal here across some of the Gulf states here. So this has kind of been a consistent story that we've been tracking, at least across North America, where more drought and heat risk here over the central part of the country. Another reason I'm leaning toward that kind of forecast shift toward the west of the ridge and the heating through the end of June, because it lines up more with that long range or seasonal forecast conversation that we've had, and some of the sea surface temperature developments in the Pacific that I know Eric's been keeping you up to date on. If we jump over, this is a Havmuller diagram. It looks a little bit confusing, and I'll admit that it is. But what I want to show you here is essentially this, let's call it a blue blob, right here at kind of the bottom of the image here. This is a forecast increase of strengthening in the trade winds over the central tropical Pacific as we go out through the end of June. And this is all to say this is going to further develop La Nina. It's going to get us a lot closer. It might even get us into official La Nina territory when it's done here. These trade wind surges bring cooler water from the eastern part of the Pacific into the central Pacific, and that's the mechanism where we get La Nina. We've been seeing this kind of slowly develop as we've gone through late spring here, with these sea surface temperatures in the central tropical Pacific decreasing. That's what you're seeing here on this graphic. But we haven't gotten down to this kind of La Nina cutoff here yet. And I think there's a good chance of that as we go through the end of June and then into early July, that perhaps by the kind of July update, which typically comes out from the Climate Prediction Center on the 8th, 9th, or the 10th, we could very well be finally into La Nina status in the Central Pacific. And really what I mean by that is the cool waters here, you can see these in the Eastern Pacific shifting more into the Central Pacific here. And those trade winds that increase there, what you saw in that blue blob, an increasing of those trade winds is going to help to extend these cooler waters into the tropical Pacific. And that's where we get a lot of the later kind of global effects from a late La Nina summer. Also, curiously, if you watch some of my West videos, I've been very focused on, again, there's that term, these are the warm blob in the North Central Pacific. We just talked about maybe a week ago how this was shifting more back toward the west, north of Hawaii. Well, as fast as I can say that, it has now shifted a little bit further east toward the coast of North America. So see this kind of shifting around west to east, east to west. We have had quite a few systems come through here. In fact, you heard Eric mention it yesterday. You saw me mention it just a few slides ago. We've had an active storm track through here, through parts of Canada, parts of the northern Midwest. That's going to continue here at least through this week before lightening up. And that's helped to, I think, shift some of the waters back and forth here, but maybe less movement of that as we go through the end of summer here into the end of June and July, which will give us a better idea of the temperature pattern here across the Eastern Pacific. I say that because if this heat continues to kind of build in here into this region, that would increase the heat risk, I would think, here across parts of the Northwest, British Columbia, the Pacific Northwest, Northern U.S. Rockies, and maybe take some of it away from the Southeast or the Four Corners region. If this area turns back cooler at the end of June, and as we get into July, I think that would kind of more so play into the current forecast, which has more of the heat over the interior or the Four Corners / Front Range, maybe parts of the Southeast, which is really kind of where our seasonal forecast is now. So again, there's another one of those fork in the roads in the forecast, keeping a close eye on the temperatures here in the Northeast Pacific. I think these matter just as much as what we're watching here in La Nina, at least for our summer heat and drought concern across parts of North America. I'll double back really quick. I mentioned that strong hurricane forecast from the NMME and a lot of the other seasonal hurricane forecasts. A huge reason for that is all the orange and red colors we see here, all the anomalous warmth in the central and the northwest or western Atlantic here and into the Caribbean as fuel for those hurricanes. Want to take a quick look at the SPC outlooks for the next 3 days, kind of give us an update on the severe weather that we're expecting. I mentioned that kind of active storm track through the northern Midwest, parts of Canada. That's bringing severe weather here for parts of northern Wisconsin, parts of much of the whole state of Minnesota, parts of Iowa here as we go through the day today on Wednesday. And to Tuesday, that's going to shift south across parts of the Corn Belt into parts of Kansas, Missouri, up through parts of Michigan with a line of storms, high confidence of this moving through kind of into the afternoon, I think more late evening, through parts of central Illinois and some of these other central Corn Belt areas. That shifting off kind of toward the right or east side of the map here into the mid-Atlantic and New England as we go through the day. Now this would be, I believe, Friday. And a renewed system now coming off the Front Range in the Rockies, bringing some severe weather back to the Central Plains, where we often see it this time of year in June, up into the kind of more northern, central, and northern plains. I want to run through the forecast here from the 3-kilometer NAM simulated radar here. Just kind of a good way to update us on where those storms are going to be firing here across parts of the Midwest as we go through the day today. This is through the afternoon of Wednesday into the evening. Here you can see storms firing here across northern Minnesota, parts of far northern Wisconsin, consistent with where that enhanced risk was from the Climate Prediction Center, or I should say the Storm Prediction Center. Take this forecast out into Thursday morning, and we can see that line here. You can see kind of during those kind of evening, early morning hours getting into Thursday, nothing going along it, but as we go through the day on Thursday and the heat builds into the area, we have the kind of remnant moisture from this June pattern and storms blowing up here late Thursday afternoon into Thursday evening across the Chicagoland area, parts of eastern Iowa, getting into central Illinois, parts of northern Indiana. I take the forecast in through Thursday night, that storm system now stretching, starting to look rather potent for some of the areas across eastern Kansas, northern Missouri, central Illinois. Maybe something more of a wind threat, just given the kind of linear nature of the storm for these areas here. But that expecting to weaken as it moves further south as night falls across very early Friday morning. Take this forecast a little bit further out just to get us through Friday, and we can see storms going up Friday afternoon in parts of the mid-Atlantic, parts of Pennsylvania, New England, really all the way up through Maine. Kind of an interesting northeast setup here for severe weather that we'll keep an eye on for June here. And then as we saw, now another system coming off the Front Range, bringing some renewed severe weather chances to parts of the Central Plains. Just want to quickly look at the ECMWF rainfall forecast over the next 10 days. This takes us out to Friday of next week. We can see the rainfall expected from those thunderstorms that we just talked about. We talked about the Florida rain. This ECMWF forecast biased toward Mexico on that gyre that coming out of Central America. We talked about the possibility of getting rainfall up into parts of the southeast, maybe even parts of the south and the mid-south. If I jump over and look at the GFS forecast through that same time period there, I'll take it through Friday. Again, you can see more focused on southeast Texas, more rain getting into the south, maybe an inch or more, and more into the mid-south. So there's another kind of fork in the forecast that we talked about, along with some of the precipitation expected through parts of the Corn Belt and northern Midwest as a result of those thunderstorms that we just discussed. I think kind of regardless of how this plays out, we're watching a drier area here across parts of the coastal plains here along the Atlantic, and potentially, extending all through this area if the ECMWF forecast is more correct. So some of the areas here are looking at warmer temperatures going through next week and a decrease in precipitation. I think some of these areas, will take the break in the precipitation, but we are seeing some kind of heat and lingering dryness now pick up here. Something to keep an eye on, not a huge concern. I'll kind of finish with this. This is the deep soil moisture percentile here for June 12th. Many areas here across the maybe eastern 2/3 of the country seeing excess soil moistures, if anything, lingering dryness and drought that has certainly been discussed here in parts of western Oklahoma, Kansas, parts just east of the Front Range here. A lot of areas doing quite well at moisture versus maybe last year in 2023 where we were kind of in the heart of some of the dry conditions that were extending across parts of the Corn Belt and the Mid-Atlantic. We do see that dryness here in parts of western Ohio and central Indiana that I talked about. Have to keep an eye on this. because of that heat we just talked about potentially moving into this area. This at least has my eye right now, but it's not a huge concern yet as we go through the end of June, especially if we get some summertime thunderstorms into here later. And then, of course, just Thursday afternoon, this area likely to receive some precipitation, which could assist in that department. So I think starting with a better base here across many of these areas, watching some areas of lingering dryness, which if you increase the warmth over that and then some long-range dry signals, that could prompt a greater concern. Certainly Florida getting a lot of rain to alleviate those drought concerns. I'll leave it there here this morning and get Eric back to you all tomorrow. Thank you for listening.